Pollination. This is the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers of the flower to the stigma. The anthers produce the pollen grains, or simply pollen. Then these pollen get transferred onto the stigma. Now, the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma of the same flower is known as self-pollination. That is, the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma of the same flower, that is self-pollination. While the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma of another flower, but of the same species, is known as cross-pollination. So in cross-pollination, the pollen grains originate from the anthers of flower A. They get transferred to the stigma of flower B. That will constitute cross-pollination. Now, there are a number of agents that bring about the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma. So the pollen is usually transferred by wind or animals. Animals such as bees, butterfly, birds, and bats carry pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma. It may be from the anthers to the stigma of the same flower, or from the anthers to the stigma of different flowers. Now, different flowers have structural adaptations that adapt them to precise agents that are used for the transfer of pollen grains. That is, the structure of any individual flower is related to the precise agent used to transfer the pollen. So there are two categories of flowers based on the agent that transfers the pollen grains. These are the wind-pollinated flowers, also known as anemophilous flowers, and the insect-pollinated flowers. So we'll start by looking at the general characteristics of anemophilous flowers in different plants. First, wind-pollinated flowers have no petals, and if present, they are very small, because the presence of petals may shelter the anthers and stigma from wind. So like in this flower here, this is a typical wind-pollinated flower. There are no petals as such. Instead, there are bracts. These bracts help to expose the anthers and the stigma to wind. So unlike other flowers, a typical flower that has large prominent petals, wind-pollinated flowers lack the petals. Instead, they have bracts, or small leaf-like structures. This is to expose the anthers and the stigma to the wind as much as possible. Another feature or adaptation of the wind-pollinated flower is that they produce a large number of pollen grains to increase the chances. You can see here they produce large number of pollen grains to increase the chances of the pollen grains landing on the stigma. So all these are pollen grains produced in large numbers by this flower. Another feature is that the pollen grains produced are small and light in weight, and usually they have a smooth outline for easy flotation and movement by the wind. So they're small, smooth in outline, and light in weight, so that they can be easily carried away by the wind. Also, the pollen grains may have wing-like extensions to aid in wind dispersal. So in this particular pollen, there are wing-like extensions that act like parachutes for easy flotation. So this makes it easy for the wind to carry the pollen grains. Another feature of wind-pollinated flowers is that the anthers are large. They're usually large with long filaments that enable the anthers to hang outside the flower where they're exposed to the wind. So if you look at this flower here, of this plant, this is the anther, the long filament that projects the anthers out of the flower. In this way, the anthers are exposed to the wind. So most wind-pollinated flowers will have these relatively large anthers with the long filaments that expose them to the wind. In addition, in these flowers, the anthers are loosely attached to the flexible filaments. So these long filaments are flexible so that they can be shaken easily by the slightest wind to release the pollen grains. So these long filaments enable the shaking of the anthers by the slightest of the wind in order to release the pollen grains. Another feature is that the stigmas also do protrude outside the flower. Like in this flower here, see the stigma protruding outside the flower on long styles where they can easily catch pollen. So if there are any pollen grains in the air, they'll be trapped by these protruding stigma. And also, the flowers that are wind-pollinated tend to have long stalks. That is, the flowers are borne on long stalks that are well above the other leaves so as not to be sheltered or protected from the wind. So like in this plant here, you can see the flowers are borne at the end of long stalks, well above the leaves. So these flowers stand alone, exposed to the wind to facilitate carrying away of the pollen grains and exposure of the stigma to the wind for pollination. So these are the general features or structural adaptations of wind-pollinated flowers. The other category of flowers are the insect-pollinated flowers, also known as entomophilous flowers. So here you also look at the general characteristics of these insect-pollinated flowers. And they have the following characteristics. One, most of them are large and conspicuous with brightly colored petals to attract insects, like in this particular flower here. Or if they happen to be small, then they occur in clusters that form an inflorescence, like in this example. So they have large, brightly colored petals for easy spotting by the insects, or if they are small, then they occur in clusters to increase their visibility. Secondly, these flowers also produce a scent, and they also produce nectar that attract insects. So generally, insect-pollinated flowers produce attractants. These attractants are in the form of a scent, and also they do produce nectar. Nectar is a sugary fluid produced by the flower that insects feed on. So these attractants in the form of scent and nectar enable the insects to visit the flowers, and in the process of visiting the flowers to get food in the form of nectar, or in some cases the pollen grains, they do effect or bring about pollination. The insect-pollinated flowers also produce large pollen grains with spiky hairs which cling to animals' body. So you can see this is a large, relatively heavy and spiky pollen grains. These are the spikes on the surface that enable the pollen grains to cling to the insect's body for some time. So in this way, the pollen grains can be transferred from one flower to another. Now, given that particular insects will prefer particular species of plants, then they do move from one plant to another of the same species, and in the process, they do carry pollen grains from the anthers of one flower to the stigma of another flower on a different plant but of the same species. Another feature of insect-pollinated flowers is that the anthers and the stigma are situated inside the flower. Usually they'll be situated inside the flower where they brush against insects in search of nectar. Another structural feature is that the stigmas are relatively small. Stigmas are relatively small as the pollen is deposited accurately on by the pollinating insect. That is, compared to the wind-pollinated flowers, the stigma of insect-pollinated flowers is relatively small. So we have those general characteristics of insect-pollinated flowers, that is, they're large and conspicuous, they have attractants, the scent and the nectar, they're brightly colored, and the pollen grains they produced are large, heavy, and they have spiky hairs to enable them adhere or attach to the insect's body. Now, in nature, cross-pollination, that is the transfer of pollen grains from one flower to another, is more common than self-pollination. So different plants have particular mechanisms and features that will hinder self-pollination and at the same time promote cross-pollination. This is because given that most flowers are bisexual, they have both male and female reproductive structures. Therefore, there is a risk of self-pollination taking place. Through self-pollination, there will be self-fertilization. And self-fertilization produces offspring that are genetically identical to their parent, hence there is no variation. Many plants have therefore evolved structural features and mechanisms that both hinder self-pollination and promote cross-pollination. So these mechanisms are the ones that you're going to look at, starting with unisexual flowers. So, monoicism and diicism greatly promote cross-pollination. So when you have unisexual flowers, in this particular case the female and the male, that means that pollen grains must come from another flower and usually on a different plant to the stigma of the female flower. So the male flower here, the staminate, produces the pollen grains, which then get transferred to the capillate, that is the female flower, where the stigma is located. So through the existence of unisexual flowers, self-pollination is hindered and at the same time cross-pollination is promoted. And this helps to bring about variation. Another feature is the presence of brightly colored and scented flowers. This attracts insects easily and also birds, which then may transfer pollen from one flower to the next in the course of their looking for and feeding on nectar. So as insects come to land on this particular flower, they feed on nectar and then fly onto another flower, in the process carrying pollen grains from this flower here onto the next one. So these attractants, the bright color and the smell, the scent, attract the insects, and as they move from one flower to another, they transfer pollen grains, thereby effecting cross-pollination. Another feature is protandry and protogeny. In some plants, the male and the female parts mature at different times. This ensures that the pollen from one flower can only germinate on the stigma of a different flower. There are two instances of how this is brought about. The first one, the phenomena is known as protandry. This is whereby the male part of the flower, that is the stamen, mature and produce the pollen grains before the female part, and in particular the stigma, has matured and is ready for pollination. So the stamens ripen before the stigma is in a condition to receive pollen grains. This condition is known as protandry. So in this particular case here, you can see the anthers are matured and they have released their pollen grains when the stigma is not yet ready. Then after a few days, the anthers will wither, and this stigma then is mature, which means the stigma can only receive pollen grains from another flower. Earlier on, the pollen grains produced by the then mature anthers have no way of effecting pollination on this, so the pollen grains are carried away to another flower. Later on, when the stigma is mature, ready to receive pollen grains, the pollen grains must come from outside. So this way, cross-pollination is effected. The other instance is where the female part matures earlier and is ready to receive pollen grains before the male part is mature. So here you can see the stigma is ready, no pollen grains coming from the anthers. So that means this stigma can only receive pollen grains from outside. Later on, the stigma dries and withers, while the male part, the anthers, matures and produces pollen grains that are then carried to another flower. So again, making sure that self-pollination does not take place. Another mechanism is heterostyle. Heterostyle is a condition in which there are two types of flower in a given species that differ in the length of their styles. There's a long style flower and the short style flower. Now, these differences minimize the chances of self-pollination in the type of flower where the long style places the stigma above the anthers. So in the long styled flower, this stigma is well above the anthers. These are the anthers here. So the stigma is well above it, so which means chances of pollen grains from these anthers getting onto the stigma are very low indeed. So therefore, this stigma can only be pollinated by pollen grains from an external source. In the short-styled flower, the anthers are above the stigma, and this of course will promote self-pollination. But in most cases, such type of flowers tend to hang upside down like this, so that with the anthers at this point and the stigma below. When these anthers release their pollen grains, the pollen grains tend to fall off. And these flowers are usually insect-pollinated, so the insect will come in from outside, go to the base where the nectaries are likely to be found, and in the process, bring along pollen grains that are deposited on the stigma. So heterostyling promotes self-pollination to some extent, but mainly promotes cross-pollination, especially in the long-styled types of flowers. Then the last mechanism that promotes cross-pollination is self-incompatibility, also known as self-sterility. This is whereby the pollen grains are sterile on the stigma of the same plant variety. There are many plants that exist in several varieties. So let's call one, we have variety A. So the pollen grains of variety A will not germinate on the stigma of the flower belonging to the same variety. It can only germinate on the stigma of a different variety of the same species, let's say variety B. So in this particular case here, so let's call this is pollen grain from variety A, and this is a stigma belonging to the same variety A. And here we have the pollen grain from another variety B. So this pollen grain of variety A fails to germinate on the stigma of the same variety, but the pollen grain from a different variety will germinate on the same stigma. So that is what is referred to by self-incompatibility. The same variety pollen and stigma will not effect pollination and fertilization, but the pollen grain must come from a different variety from the stigma in order for pollination to take place and germination to form the pollen tube, which carries the male gametes too, where the female gamete is located.